Good afternoon. My name is Bethany Servin, and I am the Marketing Director here at UsableNet. It's my great pleasure to thank you for attending today's session for the virtual conference, A Future Date, and welcome you to our presentation. Your speakers today are Jason Taylor, Tanner Gers, and Joseph DiNero. Now, without further ado, I'll hand the presentation over to Jason Taylor to get us started.
Great, thank you, Bethany. I'm just going to quickly go through the agenda so people can understand what we're going to try to cover on this. It's going to be a sort of a discussion between myself, Tanner, and Joe, and bring you sort of real world examples to each one of these. I'll start with the introductions so you get to know who the panelists are, who's speaking today. We want to talk about where user testing with the disability community fits into your overall accessibility strategy, when you should be thinking about doing testing, and how it fits together with other things that you might be doing. We want to look at why the external factors are sort of increasing the demand for this type of testing. Look at a typical project, and then go into the skill sets that we would recommend that you look for when you're looking for testers from the disability community, and then talk about how to engage and where to find some of those testers at different levels. So we want to be open as possible to how the different levels of user testing you can get. I thought I'd just start with some introduction. So my name's Jason Taylor. I work for UsableNet. We're a web accessibility company. We essentially work with lots of clients, making sure that their sites are accessible. We bring together technology and services to do that. And part of that service is to provide user testing from the disability community to verify the accessibility of websites, apps, and other types of digital products. I wanted to first introduce you to Tanner Gers of the American Foundation for the Blind. And Tanner, maybe you could give us just a brief introduction around American Federation for the Blind and your role there, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. It's a real pleasure to be here. American Foundation for the Blind was founded in 1921. It was probably most famous for the organization that Helen Keller committed 40 years of her professional life to. Today, our strategic plan focuses on three verticals around education, employment, and the aging population for people with blindness or vision loss. And so as technology and medicine intertwine together in this rapidly advancing age, we're doing our best to support the blind and visually impaired community, whether it's a baby from birth because they are now living with disabilities, or it's that aging population who might be having macular degeneration and are now coming into the blindness community. I oversee business development and sales in our consulting department. We, similar to UsableNet, we help drive the accessibility and usability of digital assets for organizations to ensure that those verticals, education, employment, and the aging population, are able to live their lives to the fullest.
Great, Tanner. I think it's relevant for us to make people aware that you are blind yourself. Maybe you could give us a brief sort of description of your journey up until today.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So I'm in a unique position, and I represent what many individuals in today's world are facing. I actually became blind as an adult in an auto accident. So I woke up in the hospital totally blind, came into the world, into this new world, just facing unknown, I was completely oblivious to the barriers that the blindness and visually impaired community faces. And so I have dedicated my career and my life to civil rights as it relates to accessibility, usability, and people living with blindness and vision loss.
Great. So actually a connection here, obviously, with the AFB and Helen Keller is actually Joseph DiNero works within the Helen Keller Services for the Blind in New York. Joe, maybe you give a quick introduction to Helen Keller Services, your role there, That would be very useful for the listeners.
Thank you, Jason. So my name is Joseph DiNero. I'm an assistive technology specialist with Helen Keller Services for the Blind. And much like AFB, Helen Keller Services provides services to the visually impaired community in the same areas: education, vocational training, and services for the Asian community. My role is within vocational services. I do assessments of clients and provide training to clients so that they either can go to school with a vocational goal or to give them training so that they can pursue a vocational goal immediately.
Great. And Joe, you also had you became blind later in life. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background on that if you feel comfortable.
Yes. So I worked prior to my role in Helen Keller Services. I worked about 10 years in the hotel industry. And during my stint there, I was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa, which is a degenerative retinal disease. So my role in life has sort of evolved. I went back to school for computer science. And then over the last few years, I've been working with Helen Keller Services, and as well as UsableNet as a user tester with UsableNet as well.
Great. So we've got some really good sort of practical stuff that we want to bring to this discussion today. So what I wanted to start with is making sure that it's clear where we practically see you should be involving people with disabilities as part of your accessibility strategy. So if I look at that from a general sort of strategy position, we talk at UsableNet about making sure that you've got 3 core principles covered when you're talking about accessibility strategy. So one is that we believe that the best way to make things accessible to everybody and to avoid things like legal suits is to create the best possible experience for assistive technology users. And that should be primarily verified by people who use those types of technologies on an active basis. So I'm going to ask Joe about in a second about where that sort of testing best fits in its practical sense. We also talk about making sure that you dovetail that with making sure that you're updating all of your UX and code like HTML and JavaScript to comply with WCAG. That is going to make sure that if your site follows WCAG, the assistive technology that people are using are going to have an easier time making sure that they can use your site. And then thirdly, we talk about part of the strategy should be communicating the effort and investment that you've made. And making sure that it's easy for people who are having issues with websites or apps to communicate with you from the disability community. So this sort of 3-level principle might be useful for people who are looking at, well, how do I create a strategy and what are the most important aspects of that strategy? So first, great experience, test it with people who use assistive technology, make sure you're following WCAG guidelines as closely as you can across all of the aspects of your site, and communicate the effort and investment. On that first element, in terms of involving people, and this is really what it's about, this whole session. Joe, maybe practically you can tell me where today you typically are deploying resources to do testing for people. So where in the sort of life cycle of the sort of accessibility journey are you finding that those resources most useful?
Well, as far as what I do with UsableNet, I'm involved in different stages in that process. So we will do user testing up front as part of an initial assessment with audits, and all of sort of a package of services. We then will do testing, following up once we've done initial reports to a client, and once they've done remediation to their site, we will do follow-up testing to verify that the remediation that they did on the site is good. And another aspect is if a client does a refresh on their site. A lot of e-commerce sites will refresh the look of their site every year and a half or two. So we'll be involved in that process as well with long-standing clients.
That's great. And Tanner, I know that AFB have a range of programs. One of them that actually stands out is that they do certification, sort of around that sort of communication of effort and investment. Could you talk about how AFB provide a sort of certification component when you're working with particular clients?
Yeah, certainly, great question. So one of the principles that we are driven by is, can a end user access and utilize or function within the digital asset as designed and intended? And so we start there. And then from that moment, once we integrate within a team and we can ensure that the core critical elements, very similar to UsableNet's approach, once those core critical elements are indeed verified to be usable, that's when we begin to expand out and start checking those boxes of the various standards. So we kind of take an upside down approach in that regard, and that might be integrated from supporting with regards to strategy and process, maybe from the wireframe stage. And then that also is effective, post-launch when in a remediation type of effort. So that's how we will approach verification and certification of the usability and accessibility of a digital asset.
Great. So let's talk about sort of where this increased demand is coming from, and I've put together a little list of where we tend to find clients deciding that they want to really make sure that they're engaging people with from the disability community in user testing as part of the strategy. And I think it's important to sort of mix these up, that it's not just one reason or one direction. And I'm going to get Tanner and Joe to help me here, but just to give you an idea, the number one reason why most people should be including people with usability is people with disability community is because that's the end goal. The end goal is to make sure that the website is used by people with disability. Now there's some obviously, but we've seen a headline around the legal side. Most legal actions are brought by people with disabilities. So clearly, if you want to make sure that you try and avoid lawsuits, you should make sure that your website works for people with disabilities. That's a clear, easy way to make sure that you're at least feeling strong that you've done testing, you've confirmed that your website works for people with disabilities. So you've got that as a defense. Interesting legislation sort of introduced more of a concept of making sure you include people. So the Air Carrier Act, and I'll get Tanner to talk about this a little bit, specifically talked about making sure that you use people from the disability community in verifying that your website is accessible, which is different than most other laws. Maybe Tanner, you could give a little bit background on that.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that really kind of expedited and, really moved forward the focus and importance of usability and accessibility, really outlining specific guidelines of achievement for what would constitute as something that would be compliant. And so I like to use a physical accessibility analogy where, if someone cannot get into the building, right, they can't get into the front door, maybe they can't use the restroom, whatever that physical inaccessibility is, the Air Carrier Act really brought that to the digital experience with regards to from the end-to-end journey. So that includes the moment from scheduling transportation, booking that transportation, the entire engagement online, as well as to the moment where they're interfacing with your team at the airport and getting onto the airplane and off the airplane. It was a truly comprehensive approach that really improved the industry.
another item that came out of the Air Carrier Act, which I felt very, very useful for people who are thinking about, well, what testing do we need to do and how much testing we should do, is the Air Carrier Act made it very clear about the priority of certain use cases on airline websites. They listed out actually 7 priority areas. So it became a lot more focused or easy to prioritize efforts, because actually, if you take that into other areas like retail or travel, or banking, you can start thinking about your top 5, top 6 use cases, and that's really what you want to be testing for. So, these are all aspects of reasons why the demand is there, and what we want to talk about is how do you actually get those people practically set up and working to test your site. So let's talk about a typical project. And I'm going to bring Joe in here because he has a lot of experience. Firstly, just to be clear, the vast majority of companies that are really attacking this right now have been nudged, I will say, that way by lawsuits. The amount of people that call us up as proactively to find solutions for accessibility do match up with the types of companies that are being sued for ADA. They're also very relevant activities for people in general, so retail, food service, entertainment. I wanted to get Joe to talk about what the typical 5 use cases that you would be sort of brought in to test in a retail situation. Could you talk about that a little bit, Joe?
So typically on a retail site, some sort of e-commerce site, we would look at the most, the high percentage things that a typical customer is going to use. So we're going to do a search for a product. We're then going to look at the results of that search on a product listing page, and to verify that that page is fully accessible. We'll go through a checkout process. So we'll go to a product description page, we'll add an item to a cart, and we'll go through the checkout process. We will look at just contacting a retailer if you have any sort of issues with a purchase. You're going to have to get engaged with customer support. So we'll typically look at if there's some sort of form to fill out, or how to access that information to reach out to the retailer. So those are some typical engagements that we will look at as far as a website in the retail space.
But it's really, I think, very clarifying for people thinking about how to involve people with disabilities in testing. And I want to be clear here. We actually advocate for involving people from the disability community in your accessibility strategy and your testing. You might hear things like user testing from people with disabilities, disability community. It's not traditional user testing. It's not testing where you provide the product without any sort of general feedback and hope people achieve something. What we typically are focused on with clients, and also, I want Joe and Tanner to talk about the value of these types of testing, is we typically focus on helping customers verify that the top user goals can be completed. The top user tasks can be completed by somebody using a particular assistive technology. And we'll get into like which ones you should test with in a second. But really, I want to talk about that, which is maybe Tanner, you could just give us a feeling of like, how you would set up testing, which is really about task completion as opposed to quote unquote user feedback as the primary, not the only, but let's say as the primary goal.
Yeah, great question. I think that no one in their right mind would publish or push live a product, a website, a mobile app without ensuring that someone can actually use it first. We're not going to roll the dice and just wish for the best, right? We're going to test the product. We're going to test the asset and make sure that people can actually use it as intended, designed, and built and developed. So the same thing is true with people with disabilities, end users. We want to ensure that they can complete the task. Joe did a great description and outline of what that might look like in the retail space. The same thing is true with travel and hospitality. So we want to make sure that end users across categories, across disability categories, can use the product, can use the digital asset as designed. And to Jason's point, that's task completion. And the user feedback will go beyond that, but really starting with that task completion, just making sure that we can get to the end goal is critical.
And one point I think we want to make here is that the ideal world is that you see a person, a user who uses an assistive technology as a persona extension to your current testing philosophy, not a separate group of people that you want to deal with later on after you've built the most perfect website, and now you're like, oh, we better make sure that website works for people with disabilities. If an organization has a testing structure which includes task completion verification, whether particular users can achieve certain goals, feedback mechanisms to give feedback on that, what you should be doing is adding a persona in that user testing world, or in that process where you've got a persona of certain types of user types. You add a persona that is someone using an assistive technology, and we will talk about the range of assistive technologies you could test with, but if you're sort of if you're restrictive, we typically recommend someone with a screen reader, someone who is blind. And I wanted to maybe, Joe, you could maybe talk to us about why you feel and why we feel in general as a group, probably why testing with someone with a screen reader is sort of your best bang for your buck in terms of getting the best understanding of how accessible a website or an app is.
Well, I think for one thing, I mean, screen readers are complex. They they interact with different browsers different ways. So what works on Internet Explorer, the screen reader behaves a little bit differently in Chrome. So you get a feel for a lot of different scenarios with a screen reader user as far as some of that. I also think screen reader users can address some other disabilities sometimes. People with mobility issues, some use different types of keyboards. We address a lot of keyboard issues within screen reader usage. Typically, a lot of times in my comments, when I'm making a report to a client, if there are keyboard issues that arise, I will even add stuff that I feel is relevant to someone that might have a mobility issue.
Great. Yeah, I just really want to emphasize that, and actually, I'm actually showing a screen right now, and I talk through the screen, obviously for Tanner and for Joe's sake as well. Screen readers are not separate things from how you use your website. So a typical user there's a website which has web code, or there's a native app, and then there's a web browser. A screen reader allows Joe to control the web browser. It's not a separate application itself that talks to the website. There is exactly the same structure as everyone else's operation. So it's important to understand that web code, so when you develop web code to the WCAG standards, what that allows the website to do is expose itself, so expose its navigation, expose other elements, to an accessibility tree. Essentially, that means that the web browser can then understand or provide the mechanism for you to navigate around that website. And then a screen reader allows Joe to control the web browser. So when you start thinking about testing, and we're going to go into sort of like how, what to test with, the understanding that you build a website to the standard, you test with particular web browsers, and then you add a screen reader. And that's going to be important. In a second, I think people are going to understand maybe where sometimes when people are testing with screen reader users, they can create a range of problems which aren't necessarily the ones that they're trying to actually uncover. So maybe we could go, Bethany, to the next slide, and we'll talk about those like technologies to test with. So, and maybe I'll get Joe to talk a little bit about this, but what I'm presenting here is, well, if we're going to test people using assistive technology, what is the combination? What's the combination we should be testing with? So there's maybe two questions. One is, what is the most likely combination of browser and screen reader, or browser and assistive technology like Zoom that your users might use? There's a second layer, which is, does that browser combination, is that a fully tested component on your original website? So I wanted to maybe first start with Tanner. What do you find is the most popular combination of browser and technology, but also let's also include Windows and iOS. What's the most popular sort of combination that you find today?
Yeah, and this is evolving and changing as there's advancements in the access and ability and capability of these assistive technologies. So we're seeing an emergence in NVDA, which is an open source free screen reader. So NVDA and Firefox is a huge one. JAWS and Chrome is another big one. JAWS and Internet Explorer. And Joe was kind of hinting at earlier too, is that, you know, I might be on JAWS and Chrome, and you know, that user experience is going to be different with a Windows 10 machine versus a Windows 7 machine. And so even this slide that Jason's showing right here that breaks down everything from, you know, NVDA and Firefox to iOS and Safari, is that things are changing all the time. And, you know, getting back to those, using this slide as a framework for how you should be testing is a great way to capture the largest case of users who are actually engaging with your assets.
And Joe, maybe because you've got a broad experience, right? Do you see a difference in terms of the types of combinations being used maybe in like education corporate as opposed to like what people use at home, like if they're not part of an organization?
Well, for many years, Internet Explorer and JAWS was the go-to combination. It was used by state agencies. It was used in the area of education. That was basically what we were as an instructor. That's the combination that we were doing instruction in. But that's evolving. More people are migrating over to Google Chrome now with JAWS, part and parcel because Microsoft is, really pushing their Edge browser now over Internet Explorer. So people are migrating over to a different browser, and they're choosing Chrome right now.
So this is always a very sort of complicated question for clients. So a client will typically say, okay, but there's lots of combinations. What should we test with? And again, I think it's a two-part question. The first question I typically ask is, what browsers do you currently test with as part of your QA? Because you're really going to want to put a screen reader on top of whatever the browser is that you know works really well with the website to make sure that you're discovering screen reader issues, not new browser issues. That's probably the biggest item that I think people have struggled with in the past. That they have a website, it's great, it works great on Chrome and Safari, and they do user testing with someone with Windows, Internet Explorer, and Gers, and they start to find lots of problems, not because of the accessibility of the site and the screen reader, but because the site has not been tested with Internet Explorer before. So instantly, someone could have problems achieving things not because of the screen reader, but because of the browser underneath. So it's one thing to really sort of emphasize that you want to start with making this part of an extension of your current QA to minimize the efforts that might come in when you start to think about remediating. And then you may want to make sure that you're writing that very clearly in your support pages, that your support team know what's been tested on, and you encourage people that maybe are using different combinations to report issues. But you will find that obviously, websites today don't support certain browsers very well, and if someone's using that browser with an assistive technology, of course they're going to have problems as well. So you want to make sure you know what you've tested with, and it's clear to everyone what you've tested with. New reported information, you're collecting what their combination is, so you can understand whether it's a browser issue potentially or whether it's a screen reader issue.
Great point,
so
Jason.
let's talk about skill sets. Like, what type of skill sets do we look for? So I'm actually going to first start with Joe, because he's sort of on a daily basis, sort of working with testers, bringing testers on, interviewing them, understanding the sort of testing that they want. What do you look for, Joe, in a tester when you're sort of adding a tester to a team?
Well, first and foremost, even before assistive technology skills, it's people who use different websites and mobile applications on a regular basis. I think that's important. Do you use retail websites or retail applications? Do you use online banking? Do you use travel, airlines, all those sort of things? I think that's important. Then it's digging down and seeing what their skill set as far as assistive technology and their strengths are as far as that goes. And assessing that, and making sure that they have a reasonably good skill set as far as being able to utilize, if it's a screen reader user, can they use more than one screen reader? Are they on multiple platforms? Do they have the ability to use multiple platforms, etc.? I think that those are some basic skills.
I love that list. We have a list up as well, which basically matches that, just to give you an idea. But I think what Joe's really saying is the list is the same list that you would typically ask for when you're recruiting, technical testers anyway. It's detail-oriented, ability to communicate, understanding the type of industry that you're in, familiarity with the types of sites. Screen reader is a tick box at the end, not the tick box at the start, if you know what I mean. It's not, oh, this person uses a screen reader. Great, let's use them. They might only be familiar with using educational sites, and they've never used a retail site before. So it's important that you understand what you're looking for, and what skill sets you're looking for, and obviously the ability to use a assistive technology on a regular basis is key. If we can move Bethany to the next, I'm going to bring Tanner in here. Tanner, maybe you can talk a little bit about the different levels. I talk about like 3 levels of where you can find testers. So sort of like, from the very sort of affordable area around, staff or friends of staff or community, like other types of companies that do like direct recruiting. And I know, we all know a few. Maybe we can mention a couple that, placing people inside of companies to do testing is obviously a very important part of potentially like our engagement level. And then third-party companies, that like yourselves, that can be hired, sort of how that structure works. Maybe you could give us a little detail across those 3.
Yeah, certainly. And there's multiple ways to skin a cat, right? And so whether I love what you're hinting at, Jason, with regards to how robust and vast the disability community is. You may never have met someone who's blind or visually impaired. I never did before I lost my sight. And so asking around with your team, with your product managers, and engaging them to see, hey, do you guys know of anybody? That's a really low cost way to bring someone in who's a stakeholder in an outcome, who wants to help your organization take their accessibility and usability to the next level. Really great way to get.
Oh, I think we just lost Tanner. Bethany, can you see if you can get Tanner back?
That's Jason, that's a great point. So I think that there's a continuum, right, of usability and accessibility testing opportunities. I think it's a really good idea for product managers and developers, your internal team. You may never have met someone with blindness or visual impairment before. I never did before I lost my sight. But the blindness and visually impaired community is a little bit more robust than people might understand. And so ask your internal team, do you happen to know of anybody that has blindness or visual impairment that might be interested in doing some testing? And that's a great low cost way to get a stakeholder who's invested in the outcome to help you take your accessibility and usability to the next level. So that's one way. Another great way is to actually source and market those candidates. Very similar case, right? Someone who may not be a professional, but a stakeholder in the outcome. And so that's how we can get maybe a group of testers giving you guys feedback and insights on what the accessibility is across different types of environments, right? We had talked before about NVDA Firefox, JAWS in Chrome, JAWS in IE, etc. And then when you start to come up the continuum or advance down the continuum, you're going to get somebody like Joe, right? Someone who's got a computer science background, someone this is their job. They know how to talk to developers. They can integrate side by side into the development process and give you that quick, immediate feedback that you need now, because that's where you're at in the development cycle.
Great. So there's different levels. We encourage everyone to sort of think about where the level is. But for us, if it's a professional organization, you've got professional testers for other things. You should be looking to engage professional testers from the disability community, whether that's through someone like the ASB or Helen Keller Institute or ourselves, where we organize the testing that to be done. We coordinate making sure we get the feedback in. We put it back into developers. We talk about the remediation that's gonna solve the issues that are found. But there's definitely a whole scale when it comes to making sure you involve people with disabilities. And let's sort of just end with the key takeaways. Hopefully people have got their own little takeaways from what we said, but I just want to emphasize again, what you want to do with user testing is set up goals, very similar to how you would look at your website these are the top 5 things people do on the website. We want to make sure that those top 5 things can be done by people with disabilities. Get feedback on, was it achieved? Was it achieved in a reasonable amount of time? Could the experience be improved? So really very specific sort of questions where you're really looking to understand achievement, but also get some feedback in terms of whether things can be improved for that particular assistive technology. For us, you want to include those people as early as possible. Again, accessibility becomes affordable if you include it early rather than add it later. If you add it later, everything becomes more expensive. So really get a persona inside of your testing environment where your user tester has a persona of using a particular assistive technology and integrate them at the same time as you do all other user testing along the process. I think it's very important that people should be considering now that native apps and how your website works on a mobile phone is as important than on a desktop. And I actually want maybe Joe to talk a little bit about this. How important is your mobile device now, Joe, compared to your desktop device when it comes to your personal use of, for example, retail or banking and other things? Give people an understanding of how important mobile is to you as a blind user.
For me, it's extremely important. I do probably most of my pretty much every area, travel, my personal banking, most of my retail purchases are done on a mobile device over a desktop. It's actually very rare that I do any sort of business in any of those areas on a desktop website at this point in the game, and I think that's very prominent just across the board for the blind community in general.
And Tanner, is that similar in your experience with regard to the importance of mobile?
Couldn't agree more. I'm engaging in this conversation through my mobile device right now, whether it's YouTube or social or email or banking or travel, retail. If I'm on Amazon, probably on my phone. And it's short-sighted to think that people with disabilities are only on desktop.
Yeah, and I think it's I mean, I'll just add that our knowledge is that 20% of lawsuits now are aimed at lawsuits around the use of mobile, not just native apps, but actually claiming that websites have not been designed properly for browsing on a mobile device. It is logical that not just lawsuits, but other types of claims, feedback that you're going to get is going to be about people trying to use assistive technology on mobile devices, because it's what the disability community have in their hand, just like everybody else in the world, 95% of the time. So if you feel as an organization that mobile is as important, if not more important than your website from a long-term strategic point of view, then it's important that you add accessibility to those priorities as well, because it's not about avoiding a website lawsuit. It's about providing accessibility to digital presence. So I think that's
Jason,
sort of our closing statement. Oh, Tanner, please go.
Yeah, I just wanted to help drive that home just a little bit more. You know, the advancements in technology today are just incredible, and there are teams across the world who are working day and night to make sure that people with disabilities can engage with this digital world that we find ourselves. So please do not lose sight of the fact that people with disabilities right now, across mobile and desktop, are trying to engage with you and your business.
Great. So this is actually time for questions. We're live on this session via our YouTube account, so we're open and available for you guys to ask questions from now. Bethany, did you have any closing statements before we go to that?
Yes, I just wanted to thank our presenters and say, if you're interested in speaking with our panelists directly, I've posted up everyone's email address on this slide, as well as my own, and we'd love to hear from you. At UsableNet, we've written about this and related topics in detail in the past, and if you'd like to receive some of those supporting resources, I've created a web page for that. It's up here. You can just go and sign up. It's exclusive to a future date attendees, and it just allows us to send you some related materials to today's topic. So that is available there. And we appreciate everyone's time today. And that concludes the panel discussion.